is Wednesday night, and this is MAAFA week at St. Paul Community Baptist Church. And we've been having a phenomenal MAAFA commemoration. Started last week, Wednesday, with our permission service, our ritual of hope. And then we've had a phenomenal time hearing from some of the finest speakers and preachers from all around the globe. And tonight will be no exception. I am absolutely delighted to have our lecturer for the week and for the MAAFA conference, Dr. Iva Carruthers. She is a phenomenal mind. We're going to post her bio because I could spend about an hour reading all of her accomplishments and all that she has done to uplift our people. We're excited. We had an opportunity to travel with Dr. Carruthers to the motherland last year, and it was a phenomenal experience. And our entire team was so uplifted and impressed and blessed to be in her presence. And I'm just so grateful that she is willing and able to be with us for this commemoration. And I'm excited. Dr. Carruthers, we're looking forward to hearing from you. God bless you. We are going to receive you right now as you come with a word to share with our people. God bless you.
God bless you, Pastor, and thank you, St. Paul family. I thank God for your pastor, for the MAAFA ministry, and for this kind invitation to join you in this journey of proclamation of the human dignity of people of African descent all over the world. I can personally testify that St. Paul's MAAFA ministry is a gift to the world, and you as a congregation have held and shared that sacred work as good stewards for over many years. I am blessed to remember when it started, and I have been blessed to work with you when, under the pastorate of Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright Jr., Trinity United Church of Christ, you ministered in Chicago. And then I worked with the team at Friendship West under the pastorate of Freddie Douglass Haynes, where you ministered in Dallas. And I look forward to be with you and journey with you as we take this sacred service to Ghana, because we are going to declare that that is our North Star. In the next few months or years, we will be in Ghana. And I'm sure your pastor has told you that he and I and a few others just returned from Wakanda. Yes, I do mean Wakanda. You see, just 2 days ago, we had the profound experience of the launch of the Pan-African Heritage World Museum. Your pastor and I were on the program. We were hosted by the grand patron of the museum, His Excellency President Akufo-Addo of Ghana, and the Honorable Kojo Yankah. And let me just say, for all of us, it was a powerful Wakanda moment, close to 2 hours. It was so much Wakanda genius and love expressed that I, along with many others, just stayed on after the program chatting. It was like being in the afterglow of ancestral and transgenerational sacrifices and memory. The hopes and aspirations of millions being fulfilled, millions who have gone on before to glory. People of African descent the world over had organized in unity. We had moved from vision to reality, planting a new institution that is grounded in our sacred memory, our authority, our diversity, the fullness of our African humanity. And to that end, we savored the moments. I called it a Wakanda moment because we had the temerity to take our gaze off the source of our MAAFA, transgenerational pain and suffering, the MAAFA old and new, and actually declare reset. We celebrated the confluence of God's blessings upon Africa as the source of creation, civilization, and culture. And we declared reset. Our story doesn't begin with the MAAFA, and neither will it end with the MAAFA. I am presently in the midst of planning the 2021 Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference for February. Our theme is Holy Rage and Holy Hope, radical reimagination for transforming communities. This theme affirms what we all know. The MAAFA is not a past tense experience. It is an ongoing one. And we are living today in a continuing 21st century MAAFA that makes your ministry all the more important. All of us are still soaking in probably the anticipated verdict that came down today around the execution of our daughter, Sister Brianna. Our people need the hope that is born out of sacred memory, out of information and proclamation, an understanding of connecting the dots between what was and what is, between where we have been and where we are trying to go. In the words of my surrogate father and mentor, John Henry Clark, history is a clock that tells you where you've been so you can know where you are and then know where you are headed. If you don't know your history, you'll choose dead-end, self-destructive roads to go down, sometimes with a smile on your face, and other times regretfully so, but it's already too late. Family, we are at that very crossroad today, and that brings me to a theological reflection on the MAAFA from the lens of holy rage and holy hope and the demand for reparations. The reason the museum launch was so important was in the title of Dr. Clark's last book, Pan-Africanism or Perish. The call to action for such a time as this is the call to commemorate the MAAFA as a sacred act of worship and declare, let no man write my epitaph. Let no one write our epitaph. And that is what I want to speak about tonight. There are just a few points I want to make and then welcome a conversation. In 1979, as a professor of sociology and epidemiology, I started tracking the Human Genome Project, recognizing that W.E. Du Bois had declared that the question of the 20th century would be the color line. My point then was what Du Bois may have not anticipated and predicted, yet we have to confront, is not that the question is still with us, but that the new racism is not merely a function of color as he saw it in a physical phenotypic sense, that is, how we look. The racism we know has emerged now in a biological genetic sense, that is, DNA, RNA crucible. Indeed, we have moved to an era of the genome and genomic solutions to problems confronting humankind. So from the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, the Berlin Conference, impoverishment, colonialism, and neocolonialism, we fast forward to 2020 and we now have the confluence of situations that are especially ominous for people of African descent in the US and by extension on the continent and the entire African world. We are living in the genomic age of COVID-19, the global pandemic, its disparate consequences and toll upon people of African descent, with a US president whose use of hate speech, coded language, and intentionally mishandling of national public health policy informs the situational analysis and our hermeneutic of suspension around our future. Dare say, even genocide if we don't discern the signs of the time. The US has now surpassed 6 million coronavirus cases and remains at the top of the global chart. 200,000 plus deaths are reported. And we know African Americans make up an overwhelming disproportionate percentage of the cases and the deaths. The racial inequities reflect underlying structural inequalities and lay bare the interlocking systems of racism and marginalization that have their origins in the MAAFA and the genocide of Native peoples. While the virus itself does not discriminate, its propagation is wreaking havoc on Black communities. COVID-19 has exposed the underbelly systems of racism, economic greed, and the denial of basic human rights to so many. It has laid bare the warped values and even sinister and demonic plots that justify and triage God's humanity in the interest of a few, and with a principle that property trumps people. In 1994, 25 years before the onset of COVID-19, in the midst of HIV and AIDS, Pulitzer Prize-winning epidemiologist Laura Garrett warned that all new diseases must first be noticed by someone who has the insight and the courage to sound an alarm and set in motion a thorough investigation. And once in place, she goes on to say, investigations are best conducted in an atmosphere of candor, collectivity, rather than secrecy, backbiting, rivalry, and mutual contempt, all of which we are experiencing right now in the United States. Given the manipulation, the misinformation, and the destabilization of confidence in a national public health system, it is no wonder that at this moment, the director of the National Bioethics Center at Tuskegee, my dear friend and colleague, the Reverend Dr. Reuben Warren, would sound the alarm. And he said, and I share with you in quote, collecting racial and ethnic data on testing, infection, morbidity, hospitalization, and mortality rates associated with COVID-19 is essential. Not collecting and sharing such data is racist by design. Where do we go from here? Surely not to trust those who have not been trustworthy. We say to you, prove yourself trustworthy before you ask for trust. And so that ought to be a guiding principle of how we respond to some of the confusion and some of the demands and requests and marketing strategies that are being sent throughout our communities, from college campuses to in the mail, marketing cold letters, to be very mindful and informed and critical of what you're being asked to do. And if COVID-19 is not enough for pause, we have to add to that the increased inhumane state-sanctioned policing violence against Black people in the U.S. You know that. I know that. Black Lives Matter movement knows that. And anybody who didn't know that yesterday ought to know it today based on the verdict that came out of Kentucky. But hear me well. On the other side of the pandemic's divide, not everyone is suffering. On the other side of the COVID-19 pandemic and the police violence pandemic, not everyone is suffering. Corporations are cashing in on COVID-19, amassing significant wealth to their shareholders and executives and owners, a small group of largely rich, white male billionaires in wealthy nations. I would suggest, if you're more interested in this, that you go to the Oxfam report, which was just released the last couple of weeks, that outlines and gives you the specific data on the extent to which corporations are profiting off of the commodification of us. Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon are expected to make together almost $27 billion more in pandemic profits over and above their already historic profits in previous years. In the United States alone, billionaires, many of them wealthy investors in large corporations, have seen their net worth increase by $792 billion. The COVID-19 donations may seem like a lot of generosity, but we need to keep that in perspective. The donations of the companies that are listed on the Global 100 list was only 0.32% of its operating income for 2019. Less than 1% was given in this moment around COVID-19. So from where I stand, a view from the bridge portends that the intersection of racism, national populism, and immigration is real, and we cannot ignore it. Contrary to an option of fulfillment of principles of a real democracy, there is a commitment to whiteness on the part of many that will send America spiraling. The Big Ten ideas or narratives that are used to uphold this commitment nationally and globally are the ideas of populist nationalism, securitization, and national security against this threat to whiteness. White norms, white values, white Christian heritage, white people, and white power. Securitization against pluralism and multiculturalism and being at the border and interfaith and cultural engagement are seen as signs of a failed race relation system and an immigration system that has to be corrected in order to protect white hegemony. Well, family, it is past time for us to dismantle this system of whiteness and to do so at its roots. The death of whiteness, grounded in ontological and theological beliefs and an ordained exceptionalism, propped up by the myth of white supremacy that was incentivized by a doctrine of discovery, is apparent. Whiteness as a movement is at war with itself, and a God that it feels has abandoned it. Thus, these acts of desperation all around us. To get at the whiteness at the roots, we must be emboldened by the words of womanist theologian, Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon, who reminded us that even when people call your truth a lie, tell it anyway. We must be reminded of the words of Ida B. Wells. The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. The truth demands the act of remembrance, emboldened in the likes of the MAAFA, which you have gifted the world. The truth demands the understanding of righteousness connected to justice versus a justice that is defined by charity, like that 0.32%. The truth compels an unapologetic demand for reparations, as only through reparatory justice and reparations will our ancestors rest in peace, because we have realized a Pan-African victory of unity and healing. St. Paul's MAAFA is an act of worship and remembrance. Thank you. And because of what you do, you walk in the sacred text. Deuteronomy 4:9 says, but take care and watch yourselves closely so as neither to forget the things that your eyes have seen, nor to let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. Lifting up remembrance is important because that is what counters the dismembering, the trauma, and the woundedness which has been inflicted by systems of acts of white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, and male privilege. We must stand in that remembrance, and in the end, the biblical phrase from generation to generation can mean a lot more about the human condition that we have yet to discern and discover. In remembering, we are able to express healthy, holy, unapologetic rage. Remembrance puts us on the path towards righteousness. Righteousness recenters and deepens our understanding of justice in a world fraught with human suffering, violence, and evil. The Christian sacred text is replete with commandments and admonishments about righteousness and justice. Yet, biblical scholars have engaged in ongoing debates about the interchangeability, the etymology, and the meaning of these words. This has had special import for biblical interpretation and exegesis of what saith the Lord about social justice and the role of the church, salvation, and good Christians. Just the other night, I was on a forum of a national Greek organization, and one person put in the chat, I separate my Christianity from politics. That is the position of those who don't understand the relationship between righteousness and justice. More frequently than not, further exploration of these debates reveal an either-or analysis, just as I have given as an example. an either or analysis of whether God's commandments or admonishments are speaking to the individual or the communal. Depending on the transliteration of the text, whether it's grounded in Greek or Hebrew, the dichotomy, the debate, or the confusion is understandable. However, what belies this debate is a basic assumption that the fundamental precepts emanate from a Hebraic, Greek, Roman, Western, linguistic, and cultural matrix, dare I say, a mythology. A critical and profound theological paradigm shift is necessary for us to eradicate racial oppression. And that theological paradigm shift must occur with us. A historiography and a hermeneutical lens of Black history that more honestly acknowledges the contributions that African civilization and culture and language made to Christianity is essential to the task of truth-telling and reckoning that will ultimately lead to healing, justice, and peace. So allow me a few minutes to share a little bit more about what I mean. The Kemetic concept of Ma'at, which engenders a multi-layered and interconnected meaning of justice and righteousness, individual and communal, king and the people, is informative and transformative. This is the basis of African spirituality, which is grounded in a belief in a God of right, regardless of what faith tradition you explore. It is this belief in righteousness that allowed us to defy the MAAFA and the door of no return and continue to be here and express our holy hope. All roads lead to the demand for reparations, which cannot be disconnected from the remembrance of the MAAFA and the celebration of our defiance. We're still here because the demand for reparations is an affirmation of the fullness of our human dignity that the God we served created. Reparations requires us to covenant and bind a process of truth-telling and reckoning and reconciliation in the face of the consequences and legacies of the transatlantic slave trade system upon people of African descent. Reparations is a process to remember, to repair, to restore, to rejoin, to replenish, to set right, to make amends, and to reconcile. Reparations can never be singularly defined and reduced to monetary terms. To do so makes a mockery of the real significance of reparations as an end in a process of distributive justice, human atonement, and redemption. Reparations is a process which compels a corporate and an individual process to confess to a moral wrong, culpability, and accountability for offenses that led to beneficial gains or harm to others. The first step in reparations is confession. The very last step is reconciliation. In Christian terms, we move through the stages of confession, contrition, restoration, and reconciliation, stages to forgiveness, ultimate atonement, and peace with God. Contrary to the argument that to forget is the pathway to healing, the silence, past and present, must be broken. The world, and most especially Christians of this generation from around the globe, must have a reckoning of the MAAFA. Healing begins with remembering. The spirit of true reconciliation and human justice begins with truth. The truth is that the transatlantic trade slave system was a crime against humanity and God, and it still stands in the breach. Now, international law defines crimes against humanity as murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, ill treatment, or deportation to slave labor. All of those categories we fit in terms of our experiences. Genocide is defined in international law as, quote, killing members of the group, causing seriously bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent. So by standards of international law, Africans have been victimized by crimes against humanity and genocide in this nation, I would argue. And by standards of causality and complicity, the church was complicit and orchestrated these crimes. The crimes were felt upon not only those of us in the diaspora, but upon an entire continent, and is still felt across the world wherever people of African descent live. The mother of the reparations movement in the United States, Callie House, said, "We deserve for the government to pay us as an indemnity for the work we and our foreparents were robbed of from the Declaration of Independence down to the emancipation." She said, "My whole soul and body are for the slave movement, and I am willing to sacrifice for it." In 1894, she and Reverend Isaiah Dickerson and Reverend Augustus Clark founded the National Ex-Slave and Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association. And since the late 1800s, many have attempted to promote the claim for reparations. They include the National Negro Congress, who in 1946 went to the UN on behalf of 13 million, quote, oppressed Negro citizens of the US of A. The NAACP submitted an appeal to the world in 47. The Civil Rights Council submitted a petition called We Charge Genocide, a historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people. In 1962, Queen Mother Moore's Reparation Committee filed a claim in California. And in 1963, let's be clear, let us tell the truth, let us do the reckoning, let us be historic. Martin Luther King declared, while no amount of gold could provide adequate compensation for the exploitation of the Negro American down through the centuries, a price could be placed on unpaid wages. Yes, Martin Luther King demanded reparations. In May 1969, James Foreman, supported by other Black faith leaders, walked down the aisles in Riverside Church in New York, and they read the Black Manifesto. And that had been developed and adopted in that same year by the National Black Economic Development Conference. The manifesto demanded $500 million as the beginning of reparations due us as a people. It was in 1989 that U.S. Representative John Conyers took up this question and began to process through the United States Congress Resolution 3745 to establish a study commission on American slavery. And in 99, that became House Resolution 40, requesting a formal apology and the establishment of the commission. You fast forward to 2007, and a group of faith leaders, primarily of African descent, convened at the World Council of Churches and the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, and they declared that reparations is essential for the healing of peoples who were once enslaved. Reparations go far beyond the financial figure. Rather, it is about recognizing the wrong that has been done. For those of you who have friends who say we can't do this and only believe in the legal process, then there is an international legal principle you could tell them about, and it's called unjust enrichment. And that essentially says if one party becomes enriched as a result of wrong done to another, the law compels the beneficiaries to make adjustments to harm parties. So yes, we're going to be in Tulsa in 2021. And yes, we were in Elaine, Arkansas in 2020. There are other precedents for U.S. reparations as well. The United States has paid, beginning with reparations to slave masters who lost the commodity of their slaves after the Emancipation Proclamation. The United States has paid reparations for Japanese internment. They paid through Europe for Germany post-World War II. They gave a few money to families of the Tuskegee Public Health Syphilis Study of the United States Department of Public Health. Today, I am proud to serve on the National African American Reparations Commission with others that you likely know. Our commission, the acronym is NARC, has issued a 10 points demand agenda. And those 10 points are 10 points that help us move towards healing and institutional representation and institutional restoration that speaks to a formal apology down to acknowledging and repairing and dismantling the criminal injustice system, providing and narrowing the gap and creating opportunity for health equity, investment in land and social economic development, the declaration of what it means to commemorate those sites of sacred memory, of sacred struggle that belong to our community and in our communal memory. We are closer than ever before to move this agenda at local levels and nationally. Though you don't hear it in the news, it is our obligation to keep on top of the demand for reparations. John Conyers issued it as a demand for study, but we've studied generations, decades since his demand, and now we are moved to a new HR 40 adaptation that talks not just about demand and study, but rather remedy. Though you didn't hear it in the news, we know there are now over 200 municipalities who have pending legislation on reparations, including the state of California and the city of Chicago. Yes, we have moved from the stadium of study to the stadium of remedy, and the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee has positioned this demand as, quote, why we can't wait. As I close, I want us to leave here clearer than ever before. Yes, the MAAFA continues. It is a 400-year plus protracted global system of institutionalized networks. But we declare, by the opening of the African, Pan-African Heritage World Museum, that African peoples, their civilizations, and their understandings of what it means to be human, what it means to know God, what it means to be in community existed before the transatlantic system, the transatlantic trade, slave trade system, before the MAAFA, before what I also refer to as the Great Abortion. We also know that the intentional ongoing efforts to use language, imagery, conscious and unconscious belief systems about African peoples and civilizations over centuries, born out of Euro-Western Christian theologies and philosophies of ethics, has created a superstructure that continues to sustain and justify a world order of Euro-Western hegemony and Afrophobia. We call this a mimetic complex framework, which is undergirded by the implementation of African dehumanization. However, family, we can discern the times, and we have caught the vision for Wakanda. We will not let anyone other than ourselves write our epitaph, how we will live and how we will die. Our foreparents went to the United Nations and declared genocide. If we have to go there soon, we will go as well. I pray for the strength of Reverend Brawley, St. Paul, and all of its ministries. I pray for the sustaining power of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference and the Pan-African Heritage World Museum, knowing that together we are on a great journey of reclaiming Pan-Africanism for this century. Thank you for having me, as together we do all we can to dismantle racism at its roots. God bless you. Amen and Ashe.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Dr. Carruthers. It was just like it was when I saw you in Ghana and when I've been telling people that it was going to be like. So what I'm going to do right now is bring Pastor Brawley back in. Everybody, if you have some questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and Pastor Brawley will be jumping in and out to have Dr. Carruthers answer some of your questions. So here comes Pastor. I'm leaving, and here comes Pastor.
Thank you, Monica. Dr. Carruthers, that was absolutely phenomenal and informative, and I feel renewed by your speech, but also challenged, deeply challenged by it. And may I say, it made me angry. And I think that that was part of what you wanted to do and accomplish tonight. Would you talk to us as we await some of the questions coming in from our audience? Would you help us understand the mission of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference and what's ahead for that great conference?
I certainly will. So the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference is named after none other than Samuel DeWitt Proctor, who was pastor emeritus at Abyssinia Church, right around the corner from you all. And Abyssinia Church, that historic church, under his leadership, was a place that became a beacon of light for prophetic liberation theology and for academic excellence. Dr. Proctor was also the president of the Virginia Union, as well as North Carolina A&T. He said that his two best worst students were none other than Reverend Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright and Reverend Jesse Jackson. Dr. Proctor, though, got a call from a president's office, Kennedy, who said, Dr. Proctor, would you please disrupt for a moment your pastorate and go to Africa and set up the Peace Corps? And he prayerfully decided he would do that. So Dr. Proctor's legacy in ministry was one that was a bridge between local, national, and global communities. Dr. Proctor's legacy connected the academy to the church, to the community. And so our organization is grounded in that legacy with that mission to build capacity of local congregations like St. Paul to do the work of justice, to stand in pulpits, to stand on stages, to go to the UN, to be a voice for our people. In February, every February for the last 17 years, we have our signature event, which is a conference where maybe over 1,000 come. This year we're doing it virtual, so we expect to have many thousands. And we expect to have people from around the world who will come into our conference, where we bring together the best of those that represent the prophetic voice for justice from the academy, from the community, and indeed from the church. And so our ministry 24/7 is to work to provide resources, educational resources, opportunity to do advocacy and activism on the ground to help churches be the voice for their people and to strengthen our own self-reliance and self-determinant behavior. We're on the ground now every day working with Get Out the Vote. We're on the ground now every day dealing with the consequences of mass incarceration. And so and also we're on the ground now, we created with the Bioethics Center at Tuskegee, a National Bioethics Commission, so that we might be able to support informing our community better about the consequences of this COVID-19. Thank you for allowing me to share that.
Well, I mean, it's one of the greatest conferences, I think, in our nation, and it helps to empower us in our prophetic voice. And so I'm grateful for the work, and I've been able to attend the conference for the last few years and bring my entire ministerial staff, and it is an opportunity for us to grow in community. So I'm grateful for your work. There is a question that came in from Nicole Duncan Smith, and she'd like you to speak a little bit more about reparations paid to slave owners after slavery.
So it's really quite simple, that we were considered property, we were commodified. And so those who were in power in the United States felt that the result of the settlement over what do we do with the Negro, where there was really a deal cut, and Abraham Lincoln said it, if I have to free some of the Negroes and keep some of them in slavery, I would do that to protect the Union. If I have to free all the slaves, I would do that to protect the Union. If I had to keep them in slavery, I would do that to protect the Union. My aim is to protect the Union. With that framework, we were viewed as a commodity, and therefore there was compensation given to those who are former masters because they lost value. They lost their productivity because of our labor, and therefore they're the ones who got the reparations. We did not get the 40 acres and the mule.
You spoke about stages of forgiveness, concluding with reconciliation. In the past, I've heard so many say, why don't we just forget about the MAAFA? Why don't we just, move on as a nation and move immediately to reconciliation? Can you review those stages again and why it's so important that we go through, as a nation, go through this entire process?
I will. And I think what I want to do is also begin with this notion of what we're talking about when we say forget. One of the things we need to understand is that forgetfulness is a sin. In the biblical text, forgetfulness is a sin. To meet and to know your Ebenezer's, where God met you, is always the Deuteronomistic demand and commandment that you remember. And what we have to understand, I think, is that the consequences of the MAAFA, the consequences have been consequences that are replete with all kinds of forms of dismembering. And the dismembering can only be countered by remembering. Now, the truth has to be viewed because we need to understand that regardless of what they do, we are obligated to remember. Right. We never forget. And it may be that they never accept our truth, but as Katie Cannon and Ida B. Wells said, we must demand to tell our truth. And if no place else, we got to tell our truth to our children and our children's children. And not to do that is a sin of forgetfulness that puts us in not a right relationship with God. And so it's important that we take our eyes off of them, but turn our eyes towards our own healing. And that healing requires us to remember. For them, it requires confession. And too often what happens is they want to go from confession to reconciliation, from some kind of simple apology and acknowledgement to reconciliation, and they don't want to do the hard work in between. And what I'm suggesting, if you look at the story of South Africa, even Bishop Tutu acknowledged that part of what the failure was in South Africa was that the Truth and Reconciliation had a lot more reconciliation than it had truth.
True.
And so Black people still don't have the land and still don't have the benefit of the natural resources that God has given that land. And so we, I think, have to understand that remembrance for us takes us through a process of repairing the damage that has been done to our mind, bodies, and spirits through an intentional dismembering process. And I want to footnote here that I think it's important, particularly as we increasingly use technology, because in another life I also developed software for children. Mm-hmm. We need to manage how much time and what our children are watching and using in terms of technology. The very act of seeing violence can reinforce violence. I have a colleague, Dr. Patricia Newman, who is a psychiatrist. She always cautions us about lifting up white supremacy, because the more you say it, it reinforces that it exists. And so it's very important for us to understand that part of the icons, the images, just basic words that are used, have power. And it's those memes that are often distributed now in this fast tech viral environment that can do harm to our children. And so it's important that we become intentional about that as a part of our remembrance. It is very important that the liturgical effort that you put into the MAAFA be done all over this country, and that we create those kinds of liturgical moments so that our people can use the fullness of our expression, of our genius, total embracing of who we are in order for us to remember our story. And that's where we really, I think, need to be in this International Decade of People of African Descent. We need to raise the question, not so much that we have argued in the past. Do you all not see our humanity? You know, when Sojourner Truth said, "Ain't I a woman?" she was really arguing, do you not see my humanity? When Bill Lucy was in that hotel and Martin King gave him a few minutes to figure out what the mantra was going to be, he wrote on a napkin, "I am a man." I am a man is saying, do you not see my humanity? Black Lives Matter is a proclamation, but it's a proclamation of our humanity. I'm ready to start a new conversation. Where is your humanity? That's the conversation we need to have as well.
Yeah.
Because of the way in which, when you ask the question, when you put up certain pictures, when you get indwelled in imagery, when you listen to competing narratives, we've got to be clear about our own. Yeah. And so for white people and for the communal national healing, you know, it does begin with truth telling. It does begin with confession. It does begin with apology, but then you got to show some contrition.
Yes.
You got to really show contrition, and that's where reparatory justice and restoration comes in. That's where we talk about the need for you to make amends at the global level in terms of the World Council of Churches and the Council of World Missions, where I'm working on a multi-year program where there's been a resolution and a commitment for reparations. We have named this movement the Zacchaeus Tax Movement. It is based on assuming that, first of all, God's creation is being totally abused, and it is creating a disintegration of community at multiple levels. Environmental justice should be connected to tax justice. In the Zacchaeus story, we understand what he did. He went through those stages, yes. And on the other side of it, he paid back multiple times over. It is that principle that then is connected to reparations that is now being talked about in this age of Afrophobia. And so we are saying that if you look at what I raised was that Oxfam report about who's benefiting from Corona. Right. This little measly 0.32% that they're giving charitable organizations as though they are doing something while they're ripping off almost $1 trillion. Then we need to figure out what does it really mean about redistributing the wealth, redistribution, and how can that happen that allows us to be whole? Because we will never make it thinking that we're going to make it from salaries, from jobs, where we are no more than a consumer.
Dr. Carruthers, there was another question that came in. Summer Spivey is asking the question about examples of non-financial reparations that have been requested or been imagined.
Sure. So about 3 years ago, one of my daughters in history, who is now deceased, a young woman, was finishing her PhD in history at the University of Wisconsin. But Doria Johnson had discovered as a little child the personal narrative of her great-grandfather's picture in every house she went in her family, and they would always tell her that he had been lynched. So she grew up with that. So she was determined to find out that story. That story in Abbeville, South Carolina, became the narrative, the story, the evidence that eventually got the U.S. Senate to apologize for lynching. Mm-hmm. In that process, we, the Proctor Conference, in partnership with the Equal Justice Initiative, in partnership with Doria, went to Abbeville, South Carolina, had a whole weekend of educational programming, of liturgical consecration of soil, of establishing and putting up a historic marker that is on the very spot that her great-grandfather was lynched. Those are the kinds of ways in which you can you can remember as a way to counter the dismembering. We are now, and we did a documentary of a commission, of truth-telling commission in Elaine, Arkansas last year. And in Elaine, Arkansas, as you may know that history, you had hundreds of people who were murdered, some in a church, just trying to organize fair payment for the cotton that they had grown, for their products, for their labor. And they were murdered while in a church. So Emmanuel in South Carolina wasn't the first by any stretch. And so one of the things that we are doing there is now working with others who are interested in figuring out how to support. And some of these are young people who are reckoning with their own sense of history, how they can help in ways that, for example, we suspect through oral history over 3 generations, there are 3 mass graves. What would it take for us to do the drone technology to find those graves and have the proper burial, just like they found the graves where? At the New York Stock Exchange, right? Right at the foot of the New York Stock Exchange. So those are the kinds of ways that are non-financial in terms of transactional payments. I'm not in any way suggesting we don't demand transactional payments. I'm understanding that money is not all it will take for us to be here.
Dr. Carruthers, this year, the theme is about I am my ancestors. And that came up out of community. Virtually, we were having a conversation, and it's an intergenerational conversation. And some of our young people said, I've noticed T-shirts that say, I am not my ancestors. And that caused us to kind of have a reaction and a conversation. And that's why we've invoked this particular theme for this year. I've done some reading relative to some of the things you have written. And I love the way you embrace sacred memory and you give so much texture to the definition. Could you share with our audience tonight your understanding, your definition, and the reason why we need to continue this work called sacred memory?
Well, I love your word texture. It's the word I use too. There is a different texture to worldview that is grounded in Africa and Western European. And it is evidenced in our very language. And that's what I meant by African spirituality being undergirded by a sense of a God of right that is different than a God who only sees justice in relationship to charity. Columbus's prayer, when he was told by Isabella to sail forth, is a prayer of one going to save the world of heathenism and to bring slaves to the empire. Let us understand that the prayers at the top of the boat were not the same as the prayers at the bottom of the boat. And so we must understand that Jesus was a Palestinian African Jew.
Yes, yes.
If we allow, as John Henry Clarke has said many times over, if you allow a people to colonize your image of God, you're already enslaved. Most people don't know this, but Dr. Clarke, before a historian, wrote over 150, maybe up to 300 short stories. The major short story that's been written in every language in the world practically is called The Child Who Painted Christ Black. And this was a real autobiographical narrative in which he was expelled from school because he dared to paint a Black Christ. His Sunday school teacher, and as a young man being a Sunday school teacher, he felt like divinity was within him and divinity was in the image of God that looked like him. He was expelled from school. Fast forward, He hoboed to New York, and the only thing he remembered from stealing his boss's library card, going to the library, was that there was this man Schomburg in New York. He hoboed to New York, found Dr. Schomburg, and found John Jackson in the library. And that's the beginning of John Henry Clark, the historian. But the point I'm making, the child who painted Christ black. If we do not allow our children to understand the divinity within,
yes,
rather the images they see of what it means to be beautiful, of what it means to be man, of what it means to be successful is defined by Western criteria, then we are forsaking the wealth of wisdom that our people have as historic memory, as sacred memory that allowed us to prosper for thousands of years before Napoleon ever got to Egypt. That's what we have to rediscover. And that's what Howard Thurman meant when he said on his first trip to Africa, what manner of spirit of these people could survive the Middle Passage?
Yes. So the work of Proctor has really, I think, helped preachers find their prophetic voice and a prophetic lens. What would you say then to the emergence of the prophethood of all believers? How can we get the pew more engaged in the prophetic work of ministry and bring together an intersection, both the preacher and the pew, to work together for the prophethood and the prophetic work of God's people?
Well, I think that this is a great opportunity to do that. There are some things that are good about this virtual moment where we have much more demand and opportunity to look in the mirror when we wake up and to ask certain questions of ourselves and of God. And in doing that, we have to ask the question of who do you say I am? And part of what I envision in my mind as an image is at the intersection of the cross is a horizontal, which represents our community and relationship with each other, and the vertical, which represents salvation. And the prophetic tradition is at that intersection. And we've got to figure out how to help people in the pew by the way we lead to understand that those things are connected. And we get them to understand that because we understand, like in this moment, we can do church and not be in brick and mortar.
Yes.
Brick and mortar does not define you doing church, right? And so the question we need to grapple with, I think, around this, whether we're in pew or pulpit, is when we leave these brick and mortar institutions and buildings, what do our communities look like? How do we sustain relationship without brick and mortar in terms of community as opposed to individualism? How do we understand that we are our brother and sister's keepers? And once we start asking a different set of questions, we can be on a different path of what it means to do ministry. Yes. And we have to understand that it's not enough for us to do charity. Yes, we need to feed hungry people, but we've got to figure out and demand and dismantle systems that create, not poor people. I don't talk about poor people. I talk about impoverished people, because there is a process and system that creates poor people.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So we've got to begin fundamentally with different assumptions. This is not about charity work. This is about a quest for justice, and that's what liberation theology is. And so it's not just James Cone talking about liberation theology. it was Cecil Cone, his brother, who said real liberation theology must also acknowledge the fact that there was something about African spirituality that preceded our understanding of Christianity. We gave Christianity to the world. The world did not convert us to Christianity.
That's right.
You can stand at the pyramids and see the book of Proverbs and the hieroglyphs.
So, Dr. Carruthers, there's 2 more questions, and I'm trying to access them. Maybe Monica can pull them up for us. But if not, I know we've had our full hour.
Well, this has certainly been a wonderful time for me.
I'm sorry, Dr. Carruthers. Do you see the question, Pastor? I just put it up on the screen.
Would you go ahead and get that?
Sure.
Would you go ahead and pull that?
Dr. Carruthers, there's a question asking, can you give more details about the 200 municipalities in reference to reparations?
Well, there is a project that is being undertaken by the law school at Howard and Columbia in collaboration, and they are beginning to do an asset map of these projects. And so they're all over now, popping up. Seattle, Washington is having conversations. The one that I'm really most closely relating to, and it's been a wonderful journey that we have shared as the National African American Reparations Commission, is the work that's going on in Evanston. Evanston, Illinois passed a resolution through the efforts and leadership of a young African American woman, alderwoman, and what they decided was that they would designate the tax revenue from marijuana sales and designate it for reparations. They then did the research to show the systemic multiple generations in which both individuals were, people had beneficial gain from the oppression of Black individuals as well as the community. And so they have decided to enter into a reparations process that they will have a fund. The first anticipated is about $10 million to be generated that will allow for them to make special housing grants. For example, they're looking at entering in because they can document very specifically the redlining that went on that prevented Black people from living in certain parts of the town. Those kinds of individual stories are the ways in which we will excavate, and Proctor's role in particular is listening for, finding, and supporting the way in which faith leadership participates in these community stakeholder processes. In Elaine, that I talked to you about, a similar thing is happening where, just for example, we know that there are documents that exist that show the land theft that went on in the Delta. And so to be able to, in that context, support the community excavating that research and that truth-telling can be very, very important into building our case. Tulsa, Oklahoma, the 100th year anniversary will be commemorated in 2021. And that's also Dr. Proctor's 100th birthday. Let me make that note for us to understand. So we're going to do something special at Proctor this year, Pastor, around his 100th. And I'll just use this opportunity to say we want to collect video reflections of those who actually knew Dr. Proctor and submit them to Proctor, as well as those who can testify how the organization, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, in his name, has made a difference in their ministry and their faith journey.
So I do see the last question of the night. What does redistribution of wealth really look like? That's coming from Cassie Young.
It looks like just what we have talked about, the identification of funds by any means necessary, but that can include a very small incremental income on the wealthiest of wealthy, which then allows for a baseline redistributed wealth or dollars to go towards basic human rights and opportunities for human dignity to all people. This is not, and this can be done globally with a modicum of increase in the ways in which taxes occur.
Right.
They call taking our federal tax dollar and giving it to farmers who don't plant in the Delta a subsidy. They call bailing out the automobile or the airline industry a subsidy. They call those same tax dollars, when they give it to us for food, welfare. Same process.
Right.
A common pot of money. It's just who gets it and how it is named that defines the human dignity that is associated with it. So we have to demand, we have to organize, we have to activate ourselves, not just in a national context, but Pastor Brawley and I understand a Pan-African, a global context, in order to create the kind of cycle and recycling of dollars that allow for dollars to flow in our communities.
I want to close out by asking the question about the conference coming up. So is this open to more of our members, or is it just for clergy? How would you frame this?
Absolutely a lay and clergy conference. It is that. We encourage that. We're being very intentional about reaching out globally so that we've had over the years requests for us to start chapters in Ghana and in England and in South Africa. Well, we're gonna launch some of that. We look forward to having a HBCU track this year. And we're going to invite these young people into spaces, these virtual spaces, and to help us speak to each other, because we believe in transgenerational mentorship. And so we look to St. Paul for sure to be very much present, as you have always been, and we're so appreciative of your support.
I think you mentioned to me that you have spoken about reparations to the UN and global platforms. Yes. Can you just, so our audience understands who we've really been listening to today?
Well, you've been listening to Iva Carruthers, but
Dr. Iva Carruthers.
We are blessed and privileged to oftentimes get invitations to World Council of Churches tables, to the UN table, because we are a certified authorized NGO, which stands for non-governmental organization. And those are organizations who go through a 2-year process of application and review. And if you get that status, it affords you opportunity to come and gather and deal with global issues and to give input as policy is made. And so it is important that our voices are present there, that our point of view is present. And we have in the last few months signed on to declarations and documents and processes that have impacted COVID-19, that have supported particularly the families in the United States who have been victims of police brutality and the inequities around the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And what we know is that the demographic shifts that are occurring and the environmental abuse are only going to create further crises of people moving from place to place, of exiling, being exiled, potential tensions for war, and food insecurity. And so it is very important that we are present and we do all we can to inform one another about what's going on, because you're not gonna get what we need from MSNBC or CNN, much less Fox News.
That's right. Dr. Carruthers, I want to thank you for being a phenomenal lecturer today and being our MAAFA 2020 lecturer. This was the most informative moment of our entire time together, and I appreciate you. And I pledge St. Paul's support to the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. Thank you for all that you do for our people. And St. Paul, thank you for being present tonight. Share this link with family and friends, and let's share this information because I believe it's transformational. Thank you so much. God bless everybody. Good night, and don't let anybody steal your joy. God bless.
God bless.